EU leaders call for Russian oil ban. US oil exports to Europe climb in a single month. De facto ban on Russian oil before EU embargo.
Hello, I'm Johnny. Thank you for joining us on FUNDAY News. It's May 5th, Thursday, and here are your top news. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen tweeted on May 4th to introduce the sixth package of sanctions against Russia. The new package provides sanctions against Russian commanders and the military, who are responsible for war crimes in Bucha. The EU also plans to disconnect Russia's largest bank, Sberbank, and two more banks from SWIFT message system. In addition, the European Union will cut off the broadcasting of 3 Russian state TV channels from European airwaves.
Good afternoon.
And she wrote, "Finally, we now propose a ban on Russian oil." While addressing the European Parliament in Strasbourg, France, on May 4th, von der Leyen proposed to EU's members nations to phase out import of crude oil from Russia within 6 months and refined products by the end of the year. The proposal needs to be unanimously approved to take effect and are likely to be subject of fierce debate, as Hungary has already publicly stated that it will veto any restrictions on Russian energy.
As the European Union sets to impose an oil embargo on Russia in the coming days, U.S. exporters are ramping up shipments of U.S. light crude to Europe. U.S. crude exports bound for Europe are close to 1.5 million barrels per day so far in April, the highest in 2 years and one of the strongest months on record. Their destinations in Europe include Spain, the United Kingdom, Denmark, and Italy. British refineries last month bought the largest volume of U.S. crude in 2.5 years.
After Washington decided to release 180 million barrels of oil from the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration shows in April, U.S. producers exported nearly 50 million barrels of crude to European buyers. Output is projected to hit a record 5.1 million barrels per day next month, with oil at more than $100 per barrel and production on the rise. According to EU's Statistics Office, Eurostat, Russia was Europeans' largest oil supplier, providing over a quarter of Europeans' imports in 2020.
By May 15th, before tighter EU rules on Russian oil sales come into effect, it seems increasingly more likely that the European Union will announce some kind of gradual embargo on Russian oil within the coming days. However, there are already de facto curbs on swaths of purchases from Russia. Trafigura Group will cease purchases of crude from Rosneft in advance of May 15th. Vito Group, the world's biggest trader of oil, has said it won't enter into new contracts for Russian crude and refined fuels.
Trafigura Group will also lower refined fuel buying. Likewise, Glencore plc has said it will stop all new trading business involving Russian commodities, since the traders are unwilling to charter expensive tankers to load Urals without a confirmed buyer. Russian oil exports to Europe have already become more challenging even before any formal ban was imposed. Urals is sold at a significantly higher price in Asia than in Europe, and it's more challenging getting it to Asia as it requires ships, insurance, and financing over a longer period of time.
U.S. President Joe Biden on May 3rd visited a Lockheed Martin's Javelin missile plant, drawing a growing concern over the U.S. sustainability in shipping vast amounts of arms to Ukraine while maintaining a healthy stockpile it may need in other regions. Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense said on the same day that Taiwan might face delays in receiving portable Stinger missile launchers until after 2026, following the confirmation that the arrival of self-propelled howitzers would be postponed.
Media reports CEO Greg Hayes of Raytheon Technology, the manufacturer of Stingers, told investors last week that Raytheon wouldn't be able to ramp up productions until next year due to parts shortage. According to Mesa reports, since Stingers were developed in the 1970s and the Pentagon has not ordered to replenish Stingers for 18 years, some components of the missile are no longer in production. Raytheon is now working closely with the U.S. Department of Defense to address this issue.
Russia completely cut off the gas supply to Poland and Bulgaria on April 27th, which made Lithuania's recent announcement of its independence from Russia gas more of an insightful political judgment. Back in 2010, Lithuania started building a floating storage regasification unit off Lithuania's Baltic coast. 12 years later, Lithuanian President Gitanas Nausėda proudly tweeted, "If we can do it, the rest of Europe can do it too." But how a floating liquefied natural gas terminal ship could be a powerful weapon in an economic war.
Lithuania's floating storage regasification unit can be built as quickly within 1 to 3 years and generally requires fewer planning permits than a permanent land-based equivalent. They can be moved from place to place, and most importantly, a country can pick its LNG suppliers. Lithuania currently sources mainly from Norway, the US, and Qatar. The unit functions with liquefied natural gas being pumped onto the vessel from a transport ship, where it is turned back into gas for use or storage.
Israeli media reports Israel is leaning toward expanding its aid to Ukraine, including sending military assistance to Kyiv. Israeli officials said the increase in aid would be a substantial step compared with what Israel has already provided. A meeting with defense officials is planned for the coming days to discuss what platforms or supplies can be provided to Ukraine. Last week, Israel's head of the Defense Ministry's Political Security Division took part in a U.S.-led summit that discussed international defense aid to Ukraine.
On May 4th, Israeli media reports Russian foreign minister said that Israelis are fighting alongside the ultra-nationalist Azov regiment in Ukraine, exacerbating tensions between Moscow and Jerusalem. After Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov wrongly argued Adolf Hitler had Jewish blood, a spokeswoman for Russia's foreign minister, Maria Zakharova, told Russian media Sputnik on May 4th that Israeli mercenaries are practically shoulder to shoulder with Azov militants in Ukraine.
The Brussels-based media Politico reports that Germany's demand on sanctioning Russia's nuclear industry was discussed in a meeting among EU ambassadors and the Commission earlier last week, with Poland and the Baltic countries leading the calls to action. Details are expected to be discussed with EU countries in the coming days. Media reports that the EU imports almost all of its uranium from outside the bloc. About 20% comes from Russia, making it the second biggest supplier to the EU after Niger.
Political reports. For Russian-made nuclear reactor in Czech Republic, Hungary, Finland, Bulgaria, Romania, and Slovakia, there is no authorized nuclear fuel alternative to the Russian supply. There have been talks between the 5 EU countries and America's supplier Westinghouse about manufacturing a replacement fuel for those Russian reactors in the long term. If Europeans want to replace the Russian supply with Kazakhstan, Canada, and Australia, they can do it, but it would cost them a premium.
Because of the soaring fertilizer and fuel costs caused by the war in Ukraine and the pandemic lockdowns, Vietnam coffee growers are planting more profitable crops like avocados, black pepper, and durians, which is helping them to offset the impact. But the Vietnam Coffee and Cocoa Association estimates that even with the extra income from these additional crops, farmers are still having to cut back investment in their coffee trees, which may lead to a 10% drop in production next season from a year earlier.
Vietnam is the world's largest grower of Robusta variety used in instant drinks and espressos. But since it buys large amounts of fertilizer from Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus, the increased costs caused by the war has made the coffee production lose profit. Win Nam Hai, the new chair of the Vietnam Coffee and Cocoa Association, said, other than avocado and durian, he also aims to replace aging trees and increase irrigation to combat climate change, helping coffee growers.
And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you all for joining us on FUNDAY News. Let's make every day a fun day. I'm Johnny Wu, your host. I'll see you next time.